A book written under Roman persecution should have nothing to say about a cartoon airing 2,000 years later. No episode has ever named a real future date correctly. Yet, in 2005, a comedy writer built an entire joke around real numbers pulled straight from the Book of Revelation, mixed with pure nonsense math. Checking which numbers were real and which were invented turned up something nobody expected. The episode people keep bringing back. The episode is called Thank God It's Doomsday. It aired on Fox on May 8th, 2005, as the 19th episode of the show's 16th season, written by Don Payne and directed by Michael Marcantel. The plot follows Homer after he watches a religious end times movie called Left Below, a direct parody of the real Left Behind novels, a 16-book best-selling fiction series by Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins, built around a specific Christian interpretation of the rapture and the events described in Revelation. The real Left Behind series sold tens of millions of copies and spawned its own film adaptations, making it one of the most commercially successful religious fiction franchises in modern American publishing, which is exactly why a mainstream animated comedy would have expected its audience to immediately recognize the parody. Convinced he can figure out exactly when the rapture will happen, Homer fills a chalkboard with nonsensical-looking math, mixing real numbers borrowed from the Bible with invented nonsense equations that don't actually follow any real mathematical logic. He calculates a specific date and time, tells the whole town, and ends up humiliated when nothing happens on schedule. The twist arrives when Homer realizes he made a small arithmetic mistake, and the rapture actually does happen one day later, pulling him alone up to heaven while everyone who mocked him gets left behind on Earth. That setup, a character confidently predicting a specific doomsday date using scripture and getting mocked for being wrong, did not appear out of nowhere. It directly parodies a very real, very well-documented pattern of people doing exactly this throughout modern history, and Payne built the joke using real details pulled from the actual Book of Revelation, rather than making everything up. Understanding how accurate those specific details really are means starting with what Revelation itself actually says, since almost none of it looks the way pop culture usually assumes. Who actually wrote it, and when? The traditional attribution of Revelation to John of Patmos has never actually been a fully settled question among scholars, even within the earliest centuries of the church itself. Dionysius of Alexandria, an influential bishop writing in the 3rd century, already argued that the Greek writing style found in Revelation differs substantially from the writing style found in the Gospel of John, right down to basic grammar and vocabulary choices, concluding the two texts were most likely written by two different people who simply shared the same common name, a genuinely early instance of internal biblical scholarship, raising authorship questions that modern scholars continue to debate using very similar linguistic tools today. Dating the text has generated its own long-running scholarly disagreement. Most contemporary scholars favor a date around 95 or 96 AD, tying the book's persecution imagery to the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian, who required subjects across the empire to publicly honor him as a god and reportedly punished those who refused. A separate, smaller group of scholars has instead argued for a considerably earlier date, sometime during the reign of the Emperor Nero in the 60s AD, pointing to internal clues within the text itself that seem to describe a temple in Jerusalem still standing, a detail that would only make sense before the Romans destroyed that same temple in 70 AD. That dating disagreement matters directly for how readers interpret the book's central villain. If Revelation was written under Nero specifically, its beast imagery could describe an already living, currently reigning tyrant. If written later under Domitian, the same imagery more likely describes a feared, half-mythical belief that Nero, despite being already dead by that point, might somehow return from the dead to persecute Christians all over again. A genuine ancient legend scholars call the Nero Redivivus myth, meaning the revived or resurrected Nero. Both dating theories point toward the same basic historical anxiety, real, lived fear of Roman imperial violence, expressed through the same coded, symbolic imagery running throughout the entire vision. The vision itself. Revelation opens with letters addressed to 7 specific early Christian churches located in Asia Minor, in modern-day Turkey, each one receiving praise, criticism, or warnings tailored to that particular community's own specific struggles. From there, the text shifts into the vision proper, describing a scroll sealed with 7 seals that gets opened one at a time, each opening triggering a new dramatic event. The opening of the first 4 seals introduces the 4 horsemen, figures riding white, red, black, and pale horses, traditionally associated with conquest, war, famine, and death, respectively. Later chapters describe 7 trumpets sounding in sequence, each one unleashing further disaster, followed by a third and final set of 7 bowls of judgment poured out one after another, a deliberate structural pattern of escalating sevens that scholars studying the book's literary construction have long pointed to as evidence of careful, intentional design, rather than a loosely assembled string of random images. Woven throughout these sequences are visions of a great dragon, a beast rising from the sea, and a separate figure called the Whore of Babylon, a symbolic woman most scholars connect directly to the city of Rome itself, dressed in imperial purple and scarlet, and sitting astride the same beast, a fairly transparent piece of imagery for John's original persecuted readers, even if it reads as far more mysterious to a modern audience unfamiliar with first-century Roman politics. The book closes with visions of final judgment, followed by the arrival of a new Jerusalem, a renewed and perfected version of the holy city descending from heaven, described with specific measurements and precious materials, symbolizing ultimate restoration and hope for the persecuted faithful. That closing image of restoration, arriving only after chapters of vivid destruction, is central to how most serious scholars read the entire book's purpose, a promise that suffering has a limit and an endpoint, rather than a puzzle box hiding a specific calendar date. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hitting subscribe means you won't miss the next one. Buried inside all of that symbolic imagery sits one specific number that has generated more popular fascination and more genuine scholarly debate than almost anything else in the entire text. The number everyone argues about. Revelation 13:18 contains the single most famous number in the entire book, describing a beast and instructing readers with understanding to calculate its number, stating plainly that the number is 666. That verse has fueled centuries of popular fascination, tying the number to everything from specific historical rulers to modern conspiracy theories about barcodes, microchips, and global governments. Mainstream biblical scholarship generally connects this number to a specific, real historical figure using a technique called gematria, an ancient practice common across Hebrew, Greek, and other ancient languages that used letters as stand-ins for numbers, allowing writers to encode a name's numerical value directly into text. The most widely cited version of this theory works by taking the title Nero Caesar, transliterating it from Greek into Hebrew letters as NRWNQSR, and adding up the resulting numerical values, a calculation that produces exactly 666. Written in plain Greek instead, the same name and title, Neron Kaiser, adds up to a completely different number, 1005, which is exactly why the Hebrew root matters so much to this particular theory. New Testament scholar Richard Bauckham has argued it would have been difficult for any other name to feel as immediately obvious to John's original readers, given how thoroughly Nero's brutal reputation had already spread across the Eastern Roman Empire by the time Revelation was written. Not every scholar accepts this specific solution without real reservations. Critics of the Nero gematria theory point out that the calculation requires a somewhat irregular Hebrew spelling of Caesar's title, that most of Revelation's original audience likely spoke Greek rather than Hebrew, making a Hebrew-based numerical code an unusually indirect way to communicate with them, and that the very earliest Christian writers who commented on the number, including the 2nd century bishop Irenaeus, writing around 180 AD, never actually mentioned Nero as a candidate at all, instead proposing entirely different names like Evanthus, Latinos, and Titan. Other researchers studying the flexibility of gematria more broadly have pointed out that the same basic method, given enough freedom in spelling choices, can be stretched to fit a surprisingly wide range of different historical names, including several other Roman emperors like Vespasian, Titus, and Hadrian. A flexibility that some scholars argue weakens any single gematria solution's claim to being the one obviously correct answer. Here is where the earlier manuscript detail becomes genuinely relevant. Because ancient copies of Revelation actually disagree about whether the correct number is 666 or 616, a variant that scholars have traced specifically to a slightly different Latin-based spelling of Nero's same name and title. Any joke, real biblical scholarship, or doomsday calculation built specifically around 666 is already working from one specific manuscript tradition rather than an absolutely settled, universally agreed number. A nuance almost never mentioned in casual conversation about the Antichrist or the mark of the beast. Why scholars disagree on what it all means. Biblical scholars generally sort interpretations of Revelation into several broad, competing schools of thought, each reading the book's symbolism through a different lens. Preterist interpreters read most or all of Revelation's imagery as describing events that were already unfolding or had already happened by the time John wrote, tied specifically to the Roman Empire's conflict with early Christianity in the 1st century, treating the book primarily as a historical document rather than a forecast. Historicist interpreters instead read Revelation's symbolic imagery as unfolding gradually across the entire span of church history, from John's own era all the way through to the present day, treating specific historical events and figures across the centuries as fulfillments of specific passages. Futurist interpreters, by contrast, read most of Revelation's dramatic imagery as describing events still entirely ahead of us, yet to occur at some undetermined future point, a view that underlies most modern popular doomsday speculation, including the Left Behind novel series, directly parodied in the Simpsons episode. A fourth major approach, called idealist interpretation, reads Revelation symbolically rather than as a description of any specific historical timeline at all, treating the cosmic battle between good and evil as a timeless spiritual truth, applicable to every generation, rather than a coded reference to any particular set of real-world events. None of these four major scholarly camps has ever achieved anything close to universal agreement among biblical scholars, and that genuine, long-standing disagreement is precisely why new doomsday predictions built around Revelation keep resurfacing generation after generation, each one confidently claiming to have finally cracked a code serious scholars still argue about openly today. The book that almost didn't make the Bible. Revelation's difficult, ambiguous symbolism did not just create modern interpretive disagreement, it nearly kept the book out of the Bible entirely. Several early church bishops and theologians expressed real documented hesitation about including Revelation in the New Testament canon, partly because its vivid, violent imagery was considered genuinely difficult to interpret responsibly, and partly out of concern that its content could be misused or twisted by people looking to manipulate frightened followers. That hesitation persisted for centuries in some corners of the early church, even after Revelation gained wider acceptance elsewhere. The book's ultimate inclusion in the accepted biblical canon came only after considerable theological debate, a history shared by several other apocalyptic texts from roughly the same era, including the previously mentioned Book of Enoch, which never achieved the same canonical status within most Christian traditions, despite covering strikingly similar themes of judgment, cosmic conflict, and final restoration. That contested canonical history matters directly for understanding why Revelation still generates so much popular confusion today. A text that respected religious authorities within the earliest church itself worried could be dangerously misread by ordinary readers has, unsurprisingly, gone on to be dangerously misread by ordinary readers repeatedly across the centuries since, right up through the specific modern doomsday predictions Don Payne's Simpsons script was directly mocking back in 2005. What the Simpsons episode actually does, with all this fact-checking Homer's chalkboard math directly against the real book of Revelation, produces a genuinely mixed result, with some details landing surprisingly close to accurate, and others clearly played for pure comedic nonsense. Revelation does contain 404 verses across its 22 chapters, a real, checkable fact, rather than an invented number pulled purely for laughs. The Last Supper, referenced separately in the Gospels rather than Revelation itself, is indeed traditionally described as involving 12 apostles alongside Jesus, another accurate detail woven into Homer's otherwise absurd calculation. The number 666 shows up prominently in Homer's math as well, tying directly back to the famous verse in Revelation, chapter 13, verse 18, about the beast. The episode's chalkboard also references the number 144,000, a figure that does appear in Revelation itself, describing a specific symbolic count of the redeemed, adding yet another genuinely accurate biblical detail into Homer's otherwise deliberately broken calculation. Once Homer's math moves past these real starting numbers, the episode deliberately collapses into pure intentional nonsense, mixing in an invented reference to counting Filipino people in the Bible and building equations that don't follow any coherent mathematical rules at all. That specific mix, a handful of genuinely accurate biblical details wrapped around a comedic mathematical mess, is exactly the writing technique that makes viral misreadings of this episode possible in the first place. Since a viewer skimming quickly might reasonably assume the entire calculation carries some kind of hidden accuracy, simply because a few of the individual numbers happen to check out. The real failed predictions. The joke is actually mocking. Homer's doomed doomsday calculation did not emerge from nowhere. It directly parodies a well-documented, repeating pattern of real people confidently predicting a specific apocalypse date using biblical numerology, only to be proven wrong every single time. Christian radio broadcaster Harold Camping, host of the Family Radio Network, famously predicted the rapture would occur on May 21st, 2011, spending millions of dollars on billboards and advertising to spread the message, before quietly revising his prediction once the date passed without incident. Camping had actually made an earlier, less publicized failed prediction back in 1994 as well, meaning his 2011 attempt was already his second public miss rather than a first-time mistake. Camping was far from an isolated case. The Jehovah's Witnesses organization has predicted specific end times dates on multiple separate occasions throughout the 20th century, including 1914, 1925, and 1975. Each prediction eventually requiring the movement to publicly walk back or reinterpret the failed date afterward. A separate and considerably darker example came in March 1997, when 39 members of a religious group called Heaven's Gate died in a coordinated mass suicide in California, timed specifically around the appearance of the Hale-Bopp comet, which group leader Marshall Applewhite had convinced followers was accompanied by a spacecraft that would carry their souls to a higher level of existence. Popular culture around the transition into the year 2000, commonly called Y2K, generated widespread, genuine public anxiety about a technological and sometimes explicitly religious apocalypse tied to computer systems failing at midnight. Anxiety that mostly evaporated once January 1st, 2000, arrived witut the predicted catastrophe. The Mayan calendar prediction surrounding December 21st, 2012, generated its own massive wave of public doomsday anxiety, based on a widespread misreading of the end of a specific calendar cycle within the ancient Maya long count system, a date Maya scholars themselves have repeatedly clarified never actually represented any kind of predicted apocalypse within the original cultural or religious context it came from. Thank God, its doomsday landed directly in the middle of this exact recurring cultural pattern, arriving in 2005, years after Y2K and Heaven's Gate, and years before Camping's 2011 prediction, mocking a phenomenon that was already well established and would go on to repeat itself multiple more times after the episode aired. This wasn't the show's only trip through scripture. Thank God. Its doomsday was far from the only time The Simpsons built an entire episode directly around biblical material, and comparing it against those other episodes helps clarify exactly how the show typically handles religious source material. A 1999 episode called Simpsons Bible Stories imagines the entire Simpson family falling asleep during a boring church sermon and dreaming themselves into 3 separate Old Testament narratives, with Homer playing Adam in the Garden of Eden, Bart playing a young David facing Goliath, and Lisa playing Queen Esther fending off Homer's version of the villain Haman. That episode treats its biblical source material with a broadly similar comedic approach to the Doomsday episode released 6 years later, pulling real, recognizable story beats directly from actual scripture and then exaggerating or subverting them for laughs rather than inventing entirely fictional biblical content from scratch. Neither episode was ever intended by its writers as a serious theological statement or a coded prophecy, and both instead function as fairly standard examples of a decades-old, well-established comedic tradition of loosely adapting familiar religious stories for a mainstream television audience already broadly familiar with the source material being parodied. That consistent pattern across multiple separate biblically themed episodes matters directly for evaluating the Doomsday episode's viral reputation today. A show that has repeatedly and openly parodied biblical material as straightforward comedy for decades, using real scripture as raw material for jokes rather than encoded messages, gives very little reason to treat one specific 2005 episode as secretly different in kind from the rest of that same established pattern. Why the joke kept coming back online. Years after its original 2005 broadcast, clips and screenshots from Thank God, It's Doomsday have periodically resurfaced online, particularly on platforms like TikTok, framed by some users as evidence the show was somehow tapping into genuine hidden biblical knowledge or secretly warning viewers about a real, still upcoming rapture date. Search interest around the episode has spiked repeatedly whenever unrelated news events touch on religious or apocalyptic themes, a pattern consistent with how other viral Simpsons prediction claims tend to resurface and fade in cycles tied to current events, rather than anything actually present in the original episode itself. That resurfacing pattern mirrors almost exactly how a completely unrelated Simpsons episode, the 1996 episode Two Bad Neighbors, kept getting recirculated online every time real-world tension involving Iran flared up, based on a 15-second joke about an unnamed, invented Ayatollah figure. In both cases, a show that has produced hundreds of episodes across nearly 4 decades happened to touch on a broad religious or political theme that later intersected, purely by coincidence, with a real unrelated news cycle, and viewers online filled in the gap between coincidence and genuine prediction using their own imagination, rather than anything actually present in the original script. The Doomsday episode's own internal joke works precisely because failed apocalypse predictions are such a reliably repeating cultural phenomenon in the first place. Mocking Harold Camping-style Doomsday math in 2005 was almost guaranteed to feel relevant again eventually, simply because someone else, somewhere, was always going to try the exact same failed calculation again within a few years, exactly as Camping himself went on to do 6 years later. What the show's own writers say about prediction claims. Simpsons executive producer Al Jean has directly addressed similar viral prediction claims involving completely different episodes on multiple occasions, most notably when fans compared a 1998 episode called Simpson Tide to Russia's actual 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Jean has explained that any apparent resemblance in cases like these tends to reflect long-term, entirely predictable historical patterns the writers were already generally aware of, rather than any kind of specific foresight about exact future events, names, or dates. Former showrunner Bill Oakley has made a similar broader point about the show, arguing that after producing more than 700 episodes across nearly 4 decades, the show was always going to occasionally touch on a theme, a number, or a general idea that later intersected with some real-world headline purely through coincidence and sheer volume of material produced over time. Applied directly to Thank God, It's Doomsday, that same logic holds up cleanly. Writer Don Payne built a joke specifically about a well-known, frequently repeating real-world phenomenon, confident doomsday predictions built on shaky biblical math, and that exact phenomenon, predictably, kept happening again and again in the years that followed the episode's original broadcast. None of the show's own writers or producers have ever claimed Thank God, It's Doomsday contained any actual hidden prophecy or secret knowledge about a real future rapture date. The episode's entire comedic structure depends specifically on Homer's calculation being wrong, since the joke's punchline is built directly around human overconfidence and mathematical failure, the exact opposite of a genuine, accurate prediction succeeding. The speculative question worth asking. There is one genuinely interesting, speculative angle worth sitting with honestly, separate from any claim about secret hidden prophecy. If a joke works specifically because it accurately mocks a real, reliably repeating human behavior pattern, does that count as a kind of prediction after all? Just aimed at a pattern of human behavior rather than at one single specific future event? That question genuinely does not have one single, settled answer, and reasonable people could land on either side of it, depending on how loosely they are willing to define the word prediction in the first place. A narrow, literal definition, correctly naming one specific future event, date, or person in advance, clearly does not apply here, since, thank God, it's Doomsday, never named May 21st, 2011, Harold Camping, or any other specific future predictor by name. A much looser, more philosophical definition, correctly anticipating that a certain kind of event was likely to keep recurring based on an already well-established historical pattern, arguably does apply, in the same limited sense that predicting winter will eventually get cold again counts as a prediction. That distinction between naming a specific unknown future event correctly and simply recognizing an already obvious repeating pattern is really the honest core of almost every viral Simpsons prediction claim ever examined closely. Whether the topic involves an invented Ayatollah, a repeating World Cup matchup, or a doomsday calculation built from real Bible verses mixed with comedic nonsense math. It is also worth remembering that the same open, unresolved uncertainty runs straight through the ancient text itself, since professional biblical scholars still cannot fully agree on who wrote Revelation, exactly when, or which specific historical figure its most famous number was originally meant to describe, nearly 2,000 years after it was first written down on a small island in the Aegean Sea. Verdict. Here is where things actually stand. The Book of Revelation is a real, extensively studied, apocalyptic text, most commonly dated to around 95 AD, and attributed to a figure called John of Patmos, though even ancient church scholars like Dionysius of Alexandria questioned whether that John matched the author of the Gospel of John, and a smaller group of modern scholars continue arguing for a considerably earlier date under Nero instead. The text's imagery is generally read by mainstream scholarship as coded commentary on Roman imperial persecution, rather than a literal countdown to a specific modern calendar date, containing genuine ongoing scholarly disagreement over its meaning across preterist, historicist, futurist, and idealist interpretive traditions, along with a real documented manuscript disagreement over whether its most famous number is 666 or 616, both numbers traceable to slightly different transliterations of the same feared name, Nero Caesar, a solution that even ancient commentators like Irenaeus never actually settled on. The 2005 Simpsons episode, Thank God, It's Doomsday, written by Don Payne, directly parodies a well-documented, repeatedly recurring real-world pattern of failed doomsday predictions, including real events like Harold Camping's 1994 and 2011 rapture predictions, decades of Jehovah's Witnesses' predicted dates, the 1997 Heaven's Gate mass suicide tied to the Hale-Bopp comet, Y2K anxiety, and the 2012 Mayan calendar scare, built using a mix of genuinely accurate biblical details, including Revelation's real 404 verse count and its real 144,000 figure, layered with deliberately absurd, non-functional math for comedic effect. Following the same well-established comedic tradition the show had already used 6 years earlier in its own Simpsons Bible Stories episode. Nothing in the episode named a specific future date that later came true, and nothing in the actual Book of Revelation has ever been reliably decoded into a working, agreed-upon calendar countdown by professional biblical scholars either. What both the ancient text and the modern cartoon joke actually reveal, when examined honestly side by side, is the exact same enduring human pattern, a persistent desire to find a hidden, decodable answer to the end of the world, applied across 2,000 years of history, one confident failed prediction at a time. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.